Hello and welcome to the Mindful Men podcast, a show inspiring men to be mindful about their lives. Each week, we'll dive into a range of topics that matter to men and hear from everyday people doing extraordinary things. So if you love the show, please give it a 5-star rating and share it with your mates. Now, before we get into this week's episode, please note that some of the content may trigger you. And if this happens, please reach out to your support networks. It's really important. If you can't get enough of Mindful Men, head over to our website. It's www.mindful-men.com.au. Find the show notes and the links to our socials there. But for now, sit back, relax, and let's get mindful. G'day guys, and welcome to another episode of the Mindful Men podcast. I'm your host, Simon Rennie, and today we're getting mindful about the business of social work. So yes, this is a social work episode. Everyone knows me as a social worker. Well, I hope you do anyway. If you don't, you do now. And joining me for today's discussion, I've got fellow social worker Tammy Roche from Canada and Australia joining me on the line. How are you going, Tammy?
I'm great, Simon. Thanks for having me.
Oh, thanks for coming on. And I was fortunate enough to be a guest on one of your podcasts. You've got a couple that are floating around. And this was way back in August last year. And we're just talking about this off air. Like that was around the time I gave up drinking and still going strong. And you've 2 years without a drink.
Almost 2 years, July, Simon. Like, what? Who am I?
Who are we? You know, the social workers, we're meant to be drinking, aren't we? I don't know. That's just going to throw that out there. But Tammy, to introduce you to the audience, you are from Canada and Australia, so you do mix your time between the two. We happen to be recording in Australia at the moment, but you're also a social worker. You run private practices across the globe. So I'm keen to unpack how that even works, because I've got big dreams for Mindful Men. And you're often found in the mountains or near the ocean, so we get a bit of both here, fortunately, on the sunny coast. And if neither are in sight, you're near a book or people. So I loved how you introduce yourself like that. Most people don't go that deep, but I think that's the social worker in you coming out. Tammy, before we get started, or we have already started, should I say, I want to ask, just right off the bat, what is social work? Because I often get confused with other professions when people call me up for my services. So I'd love to hear in your words, what is social work?
Oh, okay. So let me disclaimer, social work to me personally, because this is such a big, broad one. Social work to me is me living and doing life, doing work with my values first, leading the way. So that's social work to me. I actually, when I first started out in social work, I was very like, I've got to be professional, separate, but I actually can't do that, nor would I want to now that I am brave enough, because I think it's brave to lead with our values first. It can be messy as well. But yeah, that's what it is to me in a short answer, I would say, Simon.
I love that, actually, because when I was going through university, which wasn't that long ago, my master's degree, it was only, 3-4 years ago, 5 years ago, it would constantly come up to separate the lived and the learned experience. When you're a social worker, you're part of the helping profession. It's not about us, it's about our clients and about systems and all this type of stuff. And I'm like, but that doesn't mean I'm authentic. Like that, I was on this authenticity journey, and I'm still am. I'm really into just being my true authentic self. And I'm like, bugger that. Like I actually want to share my story and help guys by sharing some of my story. And yes, it's not about me, but if I can give something from me to help them in their journey, I think that's a wonderful thing. So I'm hearing a little bit of that in your story as well, in your definition. Do you care to elaborate?
Yeah, I went through the same thing. So I started out my practice in coaching in 2011. Even before that, I would say like 2008, 2009, I was still doing some coaching. But for me, like going that back to front and thinking about how I've like put my lived experience to now and being in that social work setting in university, I was a quiet little mouse just watching, because it was really troubling for me, because I had done so much self-work before I had showed up to that classroom. So it was about 5 years ago when I went on to do my advanced in my master's, but it was trying to not argue with the lecturers, but really ask for those deeper questions so I could understand how I could not bring me to my practice. Because for me, it was almost like I had to do some unlearning, which is good for us social workers to do, I believe. But it was this unlearning, but it was also social work is changing. It's not the same as it was years ago, and it's evolving. And so my background is I left home the first time when I was 12. Like I left home very young and I had to learn a lot of really hard skills, right? Very early and very young. And then I've always been a helper, but I've always been highly sensitive. And my beautiful nature, which I'm starting to come to this beautiful place with past Tams where I've got a lot of forgiveness, right? I really was a keen being and I was really I wanted everyone to love me and I wanted everyone to feel good and I wanted to feel seen, but I lacked the personal stuff, like, like the communication skills. So my relationships weren't always deep because of that reasoning. But when I had started the coaching and done the self work, I realized I was like, oh my goodness, now I can learn how to be even more effective. And if we go back to QUT, Calvin Grove, I remember sitting there and this gentleman came in, as they do in your first year. I think it was my first year of that course. And he came in and as I was grappling with these two things, like my values, how am I going to do this? My lived experience, how am I going to do this? He said something because I didn't like academia. Like I left school when I was young, right? Like I didn't like academia. I don't like the big words. I don't need to sound like you know what I'm talking about if I'm using words. I say to my clients all the time, I'm like, that's just, when I use a big word, sometimes I'm like, oh yeah, I wasn't trying to sound smarter than you then. I was just trying to, get that side out where I was trying to use a big word. But I remember this gentleman coming in and he said something that made sense and clicked for me. And he said, in social work, you're not going to like some of this academia. There's going to be you lived experience people out there. And he goes, and I know you, I see you. You're the ones that are trying to figure me out right now. And he said, but in order to use your voice for other people, he goes, you have to get the writing right. You have to have the academia skills. And when he said that, he had me. And he's like, how can you strengthen other people's voices if you don't strengthen your own first? And it was like that missing piece. I get so emotional. Like I could even get emotional about that because it was like, okay, I trust you. I'll let you in. And I wasn't talking about this gentleman because he was just a guest speaker, but it was my relationship with academia and how I was going to form my social work. And I knew I was going to always go out in private practice. Like I knew that. And there was none of that in my degree. So that's the long answer, Simon.
No, it's very similar to mine. I was sitting there in my lectures and tutorials, and it was very much the same. Like we're talking about all these grand theories, and I think it was almost like 2 years of grand theories and big concepts. But deep down inside me, because I had already been working in my public service career for 10, 15 years, I'm like, how do I just get to helping people where they're at? Because when I'm sitting with a guy in a therapy session, I'm not worried about capitalism. Or anything like that. Racism, yes. Ableism, yes, in the work that I do. But the bigger grand theories, feminism, am I? I don't know. Maybe. And I was always wondering, like, why am I learning this? Why am I learning this? I want to get down to how do I have a conversation with someone in a counselling setting, which we don't get, or we didn't get. I know that since I've finished that they've kind of tweaked the courses a little bit where you can get more of those practical skills. But even this last week, I was at an AASW get together and we're learning about child protection actually, which is really interesting. And one of the questions came up was how do we actually learn the practical skills to go in and work in those environments and stay in those environments as well without burning out? Because I'm talking about the high turnover, and it's like, how do we keep people in professions? How do we keep social workers in professions? And my viewpoint to that was tailor the courses to give you both the theoretical skills, but also those practical skills as well. Like how to run a business, which is what we're talking about today, is how do we, as social workers, run a business? And one of the questions was asked to the presenter, because she has her own private practice in the child protection space. And she was like talking about, when do you put your business hat on and when do you put your social work hat on? And she was talking about, well, they're one and the same hat. It's just you've got to learn how to compartmentalize the business stuff, get that stuff done so that then you can then focus on the social work and vice versa as well. And bring that social work into your policies, your procedures, and the way that you go about marketing and all that type of stuff. So it's a very interesting way that you've described it because it was me. It was me sitting in my master's degree the whole time going, well, actually, I want to be a lived experience therapist. And that was a bit of a taboo word. And since starting the podcast, I've talked to therapists of all kinds of backgrounds on the show. And I've asked this question around, what's it like to be a lived experience therapist? And some of them, they balk at the question. They're like, oh, am I allowed to be a lived experience therapist. I've been taught not to. So I like that, how you bring that lived experience in. And you said that you always wanted to get into private practice. I'd love to hear about that because that was my thing as well. Like when I sat down in my first thing, I'm like, okay, I'm coming into this to become an accredited mental health social worker and I want to run my own business. I don't want to work for anybody else. What was it like for you? How did you come to that realization? Why did you come to that realization that you wanted to be in private practice?
So I have the coaching background where I had that, but I did a lot of teaching and facilitating. It was the need I seen for people like myself. I was looking for counselors, or it might have been, I was going through that process and it was very far and few between, or I had to go to Canada and I didn't want to sometimes. I wanted to see someone in person, but I felt like it was this professional. And I'm very much like this, even if we talk clinical supervision. Can we just be here and not like this? Because I don't do well with that, and I am very well aware about the power distribution, and we can go on about that for days and not solve anything. And I don't want to, but I wanted people who felt safe because, who is it? Somebody said that quote, shame disappears when you stand in safe places to tell stories, like when your stories can be heard in safe places. Like I wanted that, right? I wanted to be that person that they could find. And we're fortunate. There's lots of them out there now. Like I feel anyways, or I haven't seen the landscape of Australia so much. I'm getting my feet on the ground here, but there is in Canada where I recently, I'll just be very self-disclosed here, but I got last year a somatic therapist for a period of time and I just finished with her. So I worked with her for about 8 months or something. And the reason I chose her was her words on her website. They weren't third party. They were talking to me about what she had been through, very to the point, nothing triggering, and how what she uses in her practice helped her, which helped me walk through in my mind how she was going to do the work for me and how I could be beside her. And I can honestly say, like, it was just, an amazing experience. So going back to your question, Simon, that for me, it was always about, I want to be that authentic. I want to be that person who can say, like, I'm there for that. That's my area. But the business side is a little bit different. So were you speaking more to that's the personal side, the beautiful value-based side, but
Well, bring it into business because you mentioned coaching a few times, and this is another buzzword in the world at the moment. But for practitioners, I see a lot more practitioners moving into coaching as well. And I'm actually thinking about doing some sort of coaching qualification so then I can put a coaching hat on and I want to work globally. Whereas as a social worker, I'm really limited to social work in Australia. And I've talked to a lot of American social workers, for example, and they're limited to where they live in the state that they live in as well, which is really feels like a box for me and I don't like that. So I'm interested in transitioning from coaching into social work, but also do you still wear both hats or do you now just wear the social work hat?
No, I've always worn both hats, even in the very beginning. Coaching for me, so I was very fortunate. I got educated with Coach U. I paid a lot. I spent about 18 months getting my certification, taught me a lot. This was before social work. This was when I got laughed at for being a life coach or business coach. Really laughed at, which I look back now, much loved pastimes again. But for me, it was always about with coaching. One thing I learned really strongly was coaching was about asking great questions. That's what coaching is, people. That's what all it is. And I remember I've always invested in coaches myself that have come along, but that's really what coaching is bringing out the greatness in somebody else. I have a coach right now in regards to like my fitness and nutrition, and she'll ask me those hard questions for me to reflect. So for me, it is always going to be intertwined. Now, if you're speaking to the credential side of it, that's where we get very complicated. So I'm a registered clinical social worker in Canada, which is very different from being an accredited mental health social worker here in Australia. I've had that credential for the last 3-4 years. I'm not even sure. There's so many different lines, and I try to stay out of those conversations because it seems to me like it gets lost in the action of doing. Do you know what I mean? Like, so people will say to me, they're like, oh, well, what about this and this? Forever we can be chasing these credentials, but I think we need to own we're enough right now. We're enough where we are, regardless of what's like, what an association says. Obviously, do your due diligence, please, mind your ethics and your practice standards, please. I think it's a time right now where we can give social workers enough credit that we can actually do that ourselves. I have colleagues who have no longer got licenses in America and they have given up that. I have got colleagues here who are no longer associated with associations. It's not registered in Australia, unfortunately. It's an association here. Same with Canada. There's some colleagues that are on their way out that are in private practice and have moved into the coaching as well, right? There's so many more opportunities. But even with my credential, I would say right now, you're probably an excellent coach already. I would say that, like, even without the credentials, because it teaches you how to ask those good questions. But I've heard your podcast episodes, Simon. Like we've chatted on mine. Like you've got those abilities to bring out things where people are reflective and given that opportunity. So yeah.
I like that because I'm often thinking in my sessions, and I don't use a huge amount of therapy tools. Like I grab something a bit from acceptance and commitment therapy, a bit from CBT. I'm really into motivational interviewing. And this is funny because I've been in supervision lately and I'm like, I feel like I need more tools. And I'm like, I might go check out motivational interviewing. And as soon as I started looking into that, I'm like, oh, I've been doing this for 2 years. I just didn't know. I didn't know I was doing it. And I've been making it up as well. And I'm like, oh, actually, this is the same thing that they talk about in motivational interviewing. And yeah, sometimes I feel like I've got the skill sets. Do I need another piece of paper? I think for me, it's more just to say, yes, I can put on a different hat from an insurance perspective. You know, I'm going through my insurances as well. So we're talking about business and social work. I'm looking at my insurance, and I'm going to say that the insurance that I've got through my association, the AASW, which is the only association here in Australia, doesn't cover me as much as I would like it to. And I'm finding this out very quickly because I'm asking these questions. I'm like, oh, does it cover me for this? And does it cover me for that? And basically they're coming back every time. And even this podcast, like, no, the podcast isn't covered by your insurance. I'm like, but I'm a social worker talking about social work stuff. Oh, no, you don't. And I'm like, okay, so now I have to go find more insurance as well. So I'm getting these new insurances to make sure I'm covered. And I'm a risk guy. I'm an anti-risk guy. I was telling my wife I love risk last night. She's like, no, you don't. And so I feel I need these insurances to cover me. Not that I do anything bad in practice, but just for that worst case scenario, which is in the back of my mind. So that's an aside note, insurance. So I'm not actually here to talk about insurance, but I am here to talk about how do you balance going between Australia and Canada? What's the differences between the work in both countries?
Oh my goodness. It's so diverse. So understanding I'm in a very remote area in the Rocky Mountains in Canada, right? So a lot of my connections are on Zoom, and I had a commercial space. I've recently given that up. So I'm virtual. And between the both, I mean, I have my practice standards for Australia and Canada, as I always do, as well as just social work practice standards in general, because there's so many of them, right? Like we can go into real big detail. There's the Canadian Association, there's the BC, and I'm registered in 3 different provinces in BC as well for my therapy. But I suppose it follows my intention, right? So a lot of people first looked at the logistics when I talk about going between two. And I find that there's a lot of interesting responses. And I should do a podcast episode on this because I get asked a lot. But it's not the logistics, it's a state of mind with the outcome aligned where I want to be. And where I want to be is in a position where I can just be wherever I need to be. That's important for my family. I've got a daughter who's now a social worker. She's 22. She's not leaving the sunny coast, right? So I've got to balance that between, I've also got a 13-year-old, and he loves skiing and I love being home. I love being in the mountains. I'm a hiker. That's my thing. So for me, it's very simply about what supports me best so I can support other people. The logistics all take care of themselves. Like insurance, I've been back to Australia 2 months now. I have never heard so much fear in the last 2 months since I've been here around insurance, around people being accredited, not accredited, this person. I'm actually very much detaching myself now because it's not that hard. And I want to be that voice that says it's actually not. What do you want to do? And let's go from there. Because I've got colleagues who have credentials. They've gone to school. They've done things. They've dropped their associations or their colleges, especially in America. I mean, that's pretty intense. I just went through the clinical examination. Oh my gosh. And we do the same exam that America does. It's quite big. And they've dropped all that. They've just gone, nope, I'm not doing it anymore. And they're traveling. They're going back and forth. They were the examples I've seen, masterminds I was a part of, and it's actually not that hard when you do it. It's just the idea of it at first. The scary stuff. It's like when I do a hike, I'm like, oh my God, don't look at the pictures, Tams. Nope, don't. You'll be fine. Right. But then once we get around people who normalize the success can be done in that way, what a gift. Like, oh, I'm so grateful for the people that have been on my path. Yeah. So it's not as hard. And I know people won't like that answer. So maybe I'll create a podcast episode and go through some, but I'm not a big logistics person. Like, cover your butt, do what your due diligence, and most importantly, align with yourself first and your values. Like, that's my social work values as well. Right. Like, yeah.
I love that. And I'm looking forward to that podcast episode so I can kind of calm down a little bit. But how long have you been in business for? Like, because my journey's only 2 years, and I have learned a lot in 2 years about myself and how business works. How long have you been in business for?
So 14 years I've been in private practice. It was all part-time. The last 4 or 5 years has been full-time in my private practice. And full-time for me is a couple days a week seeing clients. So I do client contact 3 days a week.
Did you always have this entrepreneurial like vision in your mind? Like when I was coming out of high school and I did my bachelor's degree, it was like this idea of just getting an office job somewhere. I didn't even know what that office job was. I just figured that was the safest route to live this Australian dream type thing. Like, where did this business spark come from for you?
Oh, geez. I really hope my husband's not listening to this. He is a super hard worker and he's a tradie. We've gone back the last few years because we've gone back and forth. So we've taken massive pay cuts because we chose to go back to Canada. But I watched him over 20 years, and then I was a part of his business and went in and created some systems so we could take our family around Australia and have everything good to go and travel and do whatever for that period of time. But from him, I would say, but also I feel like I was pushed into it. And I'm not sure if you felt the same, because when you live to your values, you get pushed into freedom. I started getting annoyed. I'm like, I don't want to be. And I was like this. I see it in my 13-year-old son. I see it in my daughter too. She's a bit more gentler than me, that's for sure. But it's this push of like, I don't want to be told what to do. And I'm not my best when I'm in those environments. Like, I'm not, right? So I think it came from a combination of that, the independence, and also honoring your desire. Like honoring that, like, I was meant for bigger things. Like, I'm like, I don't know what this is, and there's nothing wrong with it. Don't get me wrong in terms of working that job, but I feel like I was meant to do some things that are hard. And I don't want to do hard all the time, but it seems like that is where I'm meant to be, is that challenging spot. Because business is not easy, Simon. Like, you're 2 years, you know this. Like, everybody's like, oh, you're so, not everyone, but a lot of people are like, you're so lucky you're down at the beach watching the sunrise. And I'm like, yeah, girl, if I wasn't doing that, like, I'm not going to be okay for my first call this morning. Because I had a sleepless night last night because I'm thinking about X, Y, and Z, right? But yeah, the lucky ones. I'll do a podcast episode about that one day too, actually.
We're ticking off your future podcast episodes.
I know.
It is a great point, because I remember like coming out of high school, and I didn't have the words for mental health back then. I had been living with mental health conditions for undiagnosed for some time, 10 years at that stage, I think. And I remember saying to myself, I want to work with people like me. Didn't know what that was. I did miraculously land on a psychology undergrad. So I was doing social sciences with a psychology major. And I'm like, okay, I think this works with people like me. I still don't know what that is. Someone, they work with the brain. Okay, it must be something to do with my brain. I have no idea. But then I got to second year, and the advanced research subject comes along and you have to do statistics. And I'm like, I bombed out. Maths is not my strength, which is funny because I'm in business now. Maths is still not my strength.
I'm with you.
I lean heavily on my wife to help me with that type of stuff. And I landed in this public service job. I don't know how that happened either after my uni degree. And I was just never like feeling fulfilled. And it wasn't like my life's vision and purpose. It had a lot of good pay salary. You know, the salary was great. I was getting good superannuation. I was setting myself up for the future. And I managed to do some really interesting work and really cool work and travel a little bit around Australia. But it just didn't have me jumping out of bed at 6 a.m. in the morning, putting on my social work hat on and saying, let's talk about men's mental health on a podcast, or jumping down the beach and sitting on the sand, watching the sunrise. And in between that and a coffee, sending 5 emails or doing a social media post to say, hey, I'm here, I've got capacity, all these types of things, all the business things in between all the self-care things. And when I quit my job a couple of years ago, it was terrifying, but at the same time, so relieving. And the freedom came. And I'm still waiting for the freedom to set in because I do work a lot more now than I did before, but I'm actually more passionate about it. It's actually become like who I am and down to my bones. I'm really enjoying this business journey. And we set off air, like my wife's about to come into the business as well. By the time this comes out, my wife will be in the business because she will have now experienced that where she is able to quit her job, come work with me and find freedom in business. The harder you work, the more you get out of it, which is really exciting. I'm interested from your perspective, having been in business so long and you do work in supervision, am I right?
I started dipping in. I was a bit stubborn to start with because I was listening to a lot of fear and other people's voices about what I
Yeah.
needed to do to get there. And then I started getting some people that have had bad supervision experiences. And I just kept getting asked and asked. And I did a course and I'm like, you know what? I know what good supervision is and I know what bad supervision is. So
Yeah.
yeah, no, I have stepped into it now.
Okay. So from your business experience and your supervision experience and the work that you have with your networks and what you're hearing in the fear from social workers, if someone's listening and they want to get into private practice,
Mm.
share some of your journey and some of the things you wished you knew from day one and some of the things that you've learned. I'd love to hear some of these nuggets of gold so that they can spark their own interest in private practice because I love private practice. It's so cool to be in. I'd love to hear your thoughts on private practice and where should people start in their journeys.
Of course, get around people that are doing it. That would be the number one. I always felt this drive and sometimes an uncomfortable drive where it was like, I don't know, I must have like a social work angel somewhere in my mom maybe, who's like saying like, just go and meet so and so and they're going to lead you to so and so. Like I was talking about it before, like meeting up with people in person is so important, right? Like so important. But I think that if you're around people who talk about supervision like it's normalized, like there are groups I know where people will say, oh, we can get this for free. Whereas I will make sure, and I always have in my practice, made sure, even when I did coaching back in the day, because I had ethics I had to go to with ICF, which is International Coaching Federation. I met with my mentor or my coach, and it's no different with social workers that I was like, nope, who's my clinical supervisor? Right now, I'm looking for a supervisor at the moment, right? So when you're doing that, have that first appointment, and make sure you listen to yourself. How do you feel when you get off, right? Do you feel light? I actually did a podcast episode about this, but that piece, sometimes we can feel like, oh, they're going to give us this. And I actually even heard recently from a colleague that someone was told, oh, if you go with clinical supervision with so-and-so, they'll pass you on clients. Right? Like, make sure it's aligned with your values. Like, that is your time. Like, I know when I roll up to my supervision, I've got my due diligence of the things I want to talk about. And I say, like, this is what I need to get out of this today. That's how I usually started. And find those other social workers in your group who are like, yes, like supervision is a big thing. I couldn't do my practice without clinical supervision or peer supervision. It's just, and my goal, if we want to look at that, like what's my goal when I say those words? My goal is I want to be sustainable in my practice. Like that is the whole reason I do everything. So I work back from that. And one of them is clinical supervision for sure. But you have to love the person. Like I love my clinical supervisors in the past. Goodness, right? Like, and they helped me get to my goals. Yeah, so
Yeah.
that's clinical supervision. With gold, you might have to be a little bit more specific, Simon, to
How do I get back more money? No, that is one of them. No, you touched on something there. And when I found my supervisor, my intention with that was to find someone in private practice, because that's what I was doing, and someone who's willing to talk about private practice and the business of social work. Because, I've met social workers along my journey who might say that they're interested in sharing, but then they're more gatekeepers and see you as competition. And I'm like, well, that doesn't really align me because I'm a sharer. I'm like, sharing is caring in my book. And so
yes.
when I found my now supervisor, and I can ask anything to do with business, and she's happy to share some of her business background as well, as much as it aligns with what I do, resources, the occasional referral, but I don't expect that.
You don't expect it, yes.
No, that's just a nice add-on. And I send work her way as well. Like if I feel like she's a better fit as well. And so I'm in that really nice spot where it clicks for me, supervision. And it helps me along my business journey. So in terms of those gold things, and you're managing a business across two parts of the world, how do you go about as a social worker, like putting yourself out there and trying to get referrals and market yourself? What's some of the things that you've found work for you?
So this is a hard one because it's not my main area. Like it's not the area I'm not good at. And I think like that's just something I'm not. But I do have a secret weapon and her name is Jillian and she is my assistant and I love her deeply. She'll probably take this out of your podcast. No, she's the most humble person too. But I feel like I'm only working towards that because I actually haven't actively been marketing with intention. And a lot of people go, "What, Tams?" I focus on authentic, real relationships. I focus on giving great content on my podcast that I wish people would have shared with me. That is what I focus on. Now it's getting a little bit more specific though, but relationships are where I get all my referrals. And I've got waitlist in Australia and Canada right now. I'm like not accepting new clients. But what's interesting is like I'm still getting those requests through. And it's interesting when I track where they come from, it's usually relationships, past clients. My podcast is a big one as well, I suppose, because people can kind of dip in, right? Like on helpers and they kind of like, and then my supervisees, they can kind of listen. And I encourage you to do that if you can get access to anybody who has that. But yeah, I would say that I'm still trying to figure all that out as I go. And I think I always will be. Because how can I show up authentically? And that's what I've had the biggest problem with is like, I'm not a filter person. I like to show up on Instagram is probably the place where you'd find me the most. And I want to show up as me. I want to be the correct representation of who I actually am. My greatest compliment is when people meet me and they go, "You're exactly how you are on the podcast." Like or you're how you are in life. Like, so I'm still trying to balance that out and be completely honest with you. It's scary, Simon. It's scary.
It is putting yourself out. I love that though, like the authentic connections. And I make an effort to try and meet with referrers and shout them coffee and have a good chat about not only what I do, but what do they do? How can we support each other in our business journey? So I love meeting with independent people who are referring on. And, in the next few months, I'm going for my accreditation. So that would then become a GP's. I'm not sure how that's going to work, but we'll figure that out. I might send my wife as she comes into the business, off you go, market ourselves. I don't know how that works, but it's really important, those authentic connections and putting ourselves out there. And we're on the Mindful Men podcast. And I often say to guys, before you come see me, check me out on socials because I'm all over it. Get a feel from what I say, how I sound, what I look like. If you think that that's going to work for you, that's awesome. Come and give it a try. A lot of people that I get referrals through from Psychology Today, for example, which is weird being a social worker on Psychology Today, but that's how it works. I put a video up there and people actually, when they call me, they said, "I checked out your video on Psychology Today." It's just like a 30-second thing saying, "Hi, I'm Simon, come check me out." Like it's nothing major, but it works when you can put the face, the voice, the sound of the person, you can kind of get a bit of a feel. And you said like earlier about checking out that website for that somatic therapist and reading it in the first person. It's also what I do is I look for websites where I can see hints of lived experience.
Yes.
Particularly for OCD, like I'm trying to manage that. It's a long journey. So trying to find people that have lived experience in OCD or burnout. When I burned out in 2020 is like having someone who experienced burnout before so that it makes it easier to talk about is really important. I've got a big question for you and I'm really excited to hear your thoughts because when I was going through university, and we talked about this off air, when I went through university, we were told that social workers are poor. And there's a reason for it because we don't value financial reward for our work. We're in it for the purpose, not for the pay packet. This is what we were taught. And I'm like, no, bugger that, because I'm going to go into private practice and I want to build a business that is thriving so that if I've got a thriving business, I can support more men in their mental health journey. That's my vision. And so I'm interested to hear your thoughts being in private practice, having a family, managing businesses. What's your perspective on social workers and do you allow yourself to be in it for the money or are you just the purpose-driven social worker that we're supposedly meant to be?
Some of my colleagues sometimes say, like, when they were passing out the batons to social workers in heaven and they were like, "Okay, here you go, here you go." They're like, "Tammy, you missed the social justice one. Like, you missed that one where it's like you're fighting for something and you're fighting for that cause." And I said, "Well, that's because I was busy running away and getting to what I needed to be doing. I wasn't waiting for someone's permission or waiting for the certificate." Like the way I see it is if I'm full and I am fulfilled in what I'm doing every day, regardless. And the amount that I pay per hour doesn't equate that. Can I be honest with you? But I have a right I recently just went for my first flight. I'm going for my pilot's license. Like,
What?
That's a dream I had for ages. COVID kind of took that away. I wanted to, by the time I was 45, have that. But now it's changed to when I'm 50, I want to have my own plane. Like, that's what I want. I don't know why. I can't control these desires, Simon, but it's there, right?
That's another podcast episode.
There, exactly. But in order to do those things that light me up and that challenge me and that bring me to this place, and I could even feel it in the last week when I went and did that flight. I could feel it in my sessions. I could feel how my clarity, my beautiful desire went through. So part of that is not being a social worker who's got my hands like this. I don't know if you know them, but there are some people who are like this. And particularly, I notice in social workers who come into private practice, they might be too scared. Like, I'll talk to some new supervisees about, okay, have you got your referral list sorted? And they're like, referral list. And I'm like, who you refer out to, and it's something you don't want to take on, or it's out of your scope, or whatever it may be. And they're like, what? I can't do that. I need to take every single client. If I don't have every single client, then I'm not going to be able to. No, no, your hands are like this. We need to open them. And if we open them, we're able to receive. So for me, there is no discussion. I was actually just talking to a social worker in private practice before this call this morning. And we were talking, I was telling her my income, and she's like, oh. And I said, I know. It's almost like people get uncomfortable with that, right? And I said, but I'm normalizing it. So please pass that on and normalize it to other people. I have parts where I go, especially coming back to Australia, it's quite different, I find, then, and I'm still trying to make sense of it all, but talking about money, that hasn't been something that I've seen that is quite open. Whereas I have an abundance mindset and I can't operate out of scarcity, because if I do, it affects my clients and it affects everything else. I have a practice that I pay for really good training that's appropriate to what I'm doing. I pay for really good platforms. I don't go on any free platforms with my clients. I'm on paid platforms. So I know that their data is protected, and that's important to me. If I didn't charge a certain amount, that wouldn't matter. That would matter. But if I didn't charge a certain amount, it wouldn't matter, I suppose. Let me go back for a second. And no, Thames did say something right there. Like, it's about what's right for me and being able to know that there needs to be a flow of back and forth. That's why money's printed. It's not printed to sit in our pocket. It's printed to be spent. And I think for me, it's non-negotiable, and I'll catch myself because I sometimes still go there, remembering I've opened and closed a couple practices during COVID. So I have had that newbie experience thrown up in my face, and I've had to eat humble pie, and I've had to be humble, right? So with that, if I was sitting there like this and holding my hands tight, nothing flows, and we feel it in our body. We feel it heavy. So I don't know if that is helpful to you, but I feel very strongly about this
It
topic.
is, because I feel like self-care is also financial care.
Yes.
And if we continually give ourselves away for free and do extra work that is unpaid, how are we going to put food on the table for our own kids?
Exactly.
And pay our own bills and pay the Zoom thing that we're on now, or pay for our podcast editing, which costs me an absolute fortune, but I do it because I love the content that goes out to the world. Hashtag, if anyone wants to sponsor the podcast, please do. Please get in contact with me, because it costs me a lot of money. But that's okay. I do it because it's passion. It's my passion. It's my purpose. The one-to-one stuff I do, the workshops that I do, that all feeds into everything in the business. It's not just coming into my pocket. In fact, hardly anything comes into my pocket. It's all reinvested in the business and making the business bigger, which has bigger impact.
Can I say too that you're like me? You've got 2 kiddos. Well, I've got one adult kiddo, but they're watching what we do, not what we say. Like, as we go, and it is no difference with abundance mindset. It comes from that place of like, oh, we don't have enough for that, especially now in this climate we're in, right? So watching us make those decisions impacts, in my opinion, the most important people in my life first, right? And then it filters off from there. And it's the doing and it's the feeling. And people can feel that. They can, they can feel it.
And I've said no. And even though like my books aren't fully full, they hover. I'm on the roller coaster ride of private practice. But even this week, I said no to a client because it didn't align with my purpose and my values. And I actually referred them on. I draw through my network and go, actually, this business might be a better fit for you because of X, Y, and Z. If that doesn't work out, circle back and we can have this discussion again. But at this moment, I don't feel like I am the right fit. And that's okay. And I felt okay about that. Yes, it was money that didn't come into the business. It was the best thing, I think, for me as a practitioner, niching down into my niche, but also I think for the client and their family and what they're actually trying to achieve. So that's something I like to. I think I completely agree with as someone in private practice. Yes, I get scared when it's a light month and I'm not getting many referrals and that one comes in and I'm like, it's not really for me, but should I take it? Should I not? I always just go with my gut. But if my gut feel says it's not right, then it's not right.
And it's so true because in that space, we can't forget that it's not just monetary. It's not money. It's my energy. It's all those other bits and pieces that comes. You bring that with your client. When you show up, if you're feeling that stress and that anxiety, that client's feeling it. I don't care how much incense you're burning or what you're doing before. It's still going to show up. So it's about us being able to authentically own who we are and also saying, yes, I'm a social worker and I'm scared sometimes. Like I am scared. And you're so right. Business goes up and it goes down. How well can we flow with it? Just like rivers in Canada. I see them and I'm like, yes, such a good example, right? Like there's these huge, massive boulders and water still finds a way around. A tree will stop and water still finds, and it just flows and it doesn't question, right? It's the same with money in private practice and our ability to whatever meaning we give it. Yeah.
I love that analogy. I'm going to use that now. That is really cool. I hadn't thought about it like that before, but Tammy, I'm mindful that we have got kiddos and one of yours has to go to school soon. So quick one, I would love you to plug the business and plug your podcast because you do go into more of private practice in your podcast. So love to share that with the listeners. I'll be putting the links in the show notes, but yeah, can you give a quick plug to your business and the podcast?
Yeah. So my business is Between Two Pines because I'm Canadian. But you can find me at tammyroche.com. So that's my websites. All my podcasts are there. I have two. One is business and one is personal development. So one's for helpers. So that might be professional or otherwise. And then the other podcast, I've got over 50 episodes talking to social workers in private practice. It's the podcast I wanted. I talk more about mindset and I am trying to find social workers to bring on board for interviews to have chats. So that's where I am at. And I teach and I facilitate sometimes, but not so much right this moment. But you can always catch me on Instagram on my personal at Tammy Roche or on Social Worker Private Practice.
I feel like this is the first of many of these conversations that you and I are going to have. In fact, I've probably got about 4 more podcast episodes that we can do because we didn't quite get to everything. And that's what social workers do. We just talk and talk and talk. But before you go, Tammy, one last question I ask all of my guests to come on is to plug something that makes them feel good. And the reason I ask this is because the world is topsy-turvy at the moment. We talked a bit about fear in social workers and there's a lot of discourse happening, particularly in the work that I do in the disability space at the moment for social workers, but also the mental health space more broadly. So the reason that we're asking you to plug something to feel good is just so that we can walk away from this actually feeling good about this conversation, but also then tuning into something for self-care, like a book, a self-care activity. It could be something you're watching on telly, something you're reading, something you're listening to, anything that's making you feel good.
Okay. So it's actually not a thing. It's more of an activity. And I take this from my daily practice. I'm going to be dropping my son off at the bus and going straight down and doing it. But find yourself a rock. Go sit on a rock. Go sit on a rock for a moment, take a few deep breaths, watch the ocean. For those who are distracted, I'm neurodivergent brain, so I am like distracted as can be, but the ocean breathes in and out and shows us. And right now, there is a lot of heaviness. Like, thank you for acknowledging that. But I really believe that we need to come back to the strongest root for us, which is ourselves. Let's come back to the earth, take off your shoes, sit on a rock. Grab a blanket. I know in Southeast Queensland right now, everybody's got their jackets on and Canadian me is laughing. I'm like, this is summer. But do what you have to and allow yourself, whether that's a bushwalk, whatever that may be, give yourself permission. And it's only 10 minutes, guys. Can I say that? 10 minutes. And leave your phone in the car.
Love it. Love it. Tammy, thanks so much for coming on, getting mindful about the business of social work. As I said, I'm keen to have you back on to unpack, not unpack, but pick your brain. Probably a bit of unpacking as well as we go. But yeah, thanks so much for coming on, having a chat. Really have enjoyed catching up again with you.
Yes, thank you so much, Simon. And I think there's going to be an invite to my podcast again, too. So we'll work on that as well.
Awesome. Thank you so much. Well, that's a wrap for today's episode, and I hope you got some value from it. If anything triggered your mental health today, please reach out to your support networks.
Also, if you loved what you heard, be sure to subscribe to the show and share it with your mates. For more from Mindful Men, you can check us out on Instagram and YouTube, and I'll throw the links to these pages in the show notes below. But until next time, stay mindful.